It's so cold and windy here today, Grandma had to put on her bunny socks. Hopefully, it's a little warmer where you are. So I think today we will finish up Night of the Living Dummy by R.L. Stine. We left off on chapter 17. You have to believe me, Chris cried in a trembling voice. I really didn't say any of those things. Mr. Wood was talking by himself. Lindy rolled her eyes. Tell me another one, she muttered sarcastically. Lindy had followed Chris upstairs. Down in the living room, her parents were still apologizing to the Millers. Now, Chris sat on the edge of her bed, wiping tears off her cheeks. Lindy stood with her arms crossed in front of the dressing table. I don't make insulting jokes like that, Chris said, glancing at Mr. Wood, who lay crumpled in the center of the floor where Chris had tossed him. You know that isn't my sense of humor. So why'd you do it? Lindy demanded. Why do you want to make everyone mad? But I didn't, Chris shrieked, tugging at the sides of her hair. Mr. Wood said those things. I didn't. How can you be such a copycat? Lindy asked disgustedly. I already did that joke, Chris. Can't you think of something original? It's not a joke, Chris insisted. Why don't you believe me? No way, Lindy replied, shaking her head, her arms still crossed in front of her chest. No way I'm going to fall for the same gag. Lindy, please, Chris pleaded. I'm frightened. I'm really frightened. Yeah, sure, Lindy said sarcastically. I'm shaking all over, too. Wow, you really fooled me, Chris. Guess you showed me you can play funny tricks, too. Shut up, Chris snapped. More tears formed in the corners of her eyes. Very good crying, Lindy said. But it doesn't fool me either. And it won't fool Mom and Dad. She turned and picked up Slappy. Maybe Slappy and I should practice some jokes. After your performance tonight, Mom and Dad might not let you do the concert tomorrow night. She slung Slappy over her shoulder and, stepping over the crumpled form of Mr. Wood, hurried from the room. It was hot and noisy backstage in the auditorium. Chris's throat was dry, and she kept walking over to the water fountain and slurping mouthfuls of the warm water. The voices of the audience on the other side of the curtain seemed to echo off all four walls in the ceiling. The louder the noise became as the auditorium filled, the more nervous Chris felt. How am I ever going to do my act in front of all those people? She asked herself, pulling the edge of the curtain back a few inches and peering out. Her parents were off to the side in the third row. Seeing them brought memories of the night before flooding back to Chris. Her parents had grounded her for 2 weeks as punishment for insulting the Millers. They almost hadn't let her come to the concert. Chris stared at the kids and adults filing into the large auditorium, recognizing a lot of faces. She realized her hands were ice cold. Her throat was dry again. Don't think of it as an audience, she told herself. Think of it as a bunch of kids and parents, most of whom you know. Somehow, that made it worse. She let go of the curtain, hurried to get one last drink from the fountain, then retrieved Mr. Wood from the table she had left him on. The room suddenly grew quiet on the other side of the curtain. The concert was about to begin. "Break a leg!" Lindy called across to her as she hurried to join the other chorus members. "Thanks," Chris replied weakly. She pulled up Mr. Wood and straightened his shirt. "Your hands are clammy," she made him say. "No insults tonight," Chris told him sternly. To her shock, the dummy blinked. "Hey!" she cried. She hadn't touched his eye controls. She had a stab of fear that went beyond stage fright. Maybe I shouldn't go on with this, she thought, staring intently at Mr. Wood, watching for him to blink again. Maybe I should say I'm sick and not perform with him. "Are you nervous?" a voice whispered. "Huh?" At first, she thought it was Mr. Wood, but then she quickly realized that it was Mrs. Berman, the music teacher. "Yeah, a little," Chris admitted, feeling her face grow hot. "You'll be terrific," Mrs. Berman gushed, squeezing Chris's shoulder with a sweaty hand. She was a heavy-set woman with several chins, a red lipsticked mouth, and flowing black hair. She was wearing a long, loose-fitting dress of red and blue flower patterns. "Here goes," she said, giving Chris's shoulder one more squeeze. Then she stepped on stage, blinking against the harsh white light of the spotlight, to introduce Chris and Mr. Wood. "Am I really doing this?" Chris asked herself. "Can I do this?" Her heart was pounding so hard she couldn't hear Mrs. Berman's introduction. Then, suddenly, the audience was applauding, and Chris found herself walking across the stage to the microphone, carrying Mr. Wood in both hands. Mrs. Berman, her flowery dress flowing around her, was heading off stage. She smiled at Chris and gave her an encouraging wink as they passed each other. Squinting against the bright spotlight, Chris walked to the middle of the stage. Her mouth felt as dry as cotton. She wondered if she could make a sound. A folding chair had been set up for her. She sat down, arranging Mr. Wood on her lap, then realized that the microphone was much too high. This drew titters of soft laughter from the audience. Embarrassed, Chris stood up and, holding Mr. Wood under one arm, struggled to lower the microphone. "Are you having trouble?" Mrs. Berman called from the side of the stage. She hurried over to help Chris. But before the music teacher got halfway across the stage, Mr. Wood leaned into the microphone. "What time does the blimp go up?" he rasped nastily, staring at Mrs. Berman's dress. "What?" She stopped in surprise. "Your face reminds me of a wart I had removed," Mr. Wood growled at the startled woman. Her mouth dropped open in horror. "Chris!" "If we count your chins, will it tell us your age?" There was laughter floating up from the audience, but it was mixed with gasps of horror. "Chris, that's enough!" Mrs. Berman cried, the microphone picking up her angry protest. "You're more than enough! You're enough for two!" Mr. Wood declared nastily. "If you got any bigger, you'd need your own zip code!" "Chris, really? I'm going to ask you to apologize," Mrs. Berman said, her face bright red. "Mrs. Berman, I'm not doing it," Chris stammered. "I'm not saying those things." "Please apologize to me and to the audience," Mrs. Berman demanded. Mr. Wood leaned into the microphone. "Apologize for this!" he screamed. The dummy's head tilted back, his jaw dropped, his mouth opened wide, and a thick green liquid came spewing out. "Yuck!" someone screamed. It looked like pea soup. It spurted up out of Mr. Wood's open mouth like water rushing from a fire hose. Voices screamed and cried out their surprise as the thick green liquid showered over the people in the front rows. "Stop it! Ugh, help! Somebody turn it off! It stinks!" Chris froze in horror, staring as more and more of the disgusting substance poured from her dummy's gaping mouth. A putrid stench, the smell of sour milk, rotten eggs, burning rubber, and decayed meat rose up from the liquid. It puddled over the stage and showered over the front seats. Blinded by the spotlight, Chris couldn't see the audience in front of her, but she could hear the choking and the gagging, the frantic cries for help. "Clear the auditorium! Clear the auditorium!" Mrs. Berman was shouting. Chris heard the rumble and scrape of people shoving their way up the aisles and out the doors. "It stinks! Ugh, I'm sick! Somebody help!" Chris tried to clamp her hand over the dummy's mouth, but the force of the putrid green liquid frothing and spewing out was too strong. It pushed her hand away. Suddenly, she realized she was being shoved from behind, off the stage, away from the shouting people fleeing the auditorium, out of the glaring spotlight. She was backstage before she realized that it was Mrs. Berman who was pushing her. I don't know how you did it, or why," Mrs. Berman shouted angrily, frantically wiping splotches of the disgusting green liquid off the front of her dress with both hands. "But I'm going to see that you're suspended from school, Chris, and if I have my way, you'll be suspended for life." Chapter 18. "That's right. Close the door," Mr. Powell said sternly, glaring with narrowed eyes at Chris. He stood a few inches behind her, arms crossed in front of him, making sure she followed his instructions. She had carefully folded Mr. Wood in half and shoved him to the back of her closet shelf. Now she closed the closet, making sure it was completely shut as he ordered. Lindy watched silently from her bed, her expression troubled. "Does the closet door lock?" Mr. Powell asked. "No, not really," Chris told him, lowering her head. "Well, that will have to do," he said. "On Monday, I'm taking him back to the pawn shop. Do not take him out until then." "But, Dad," he raised a hand to silence her. "We have to talk about this," Chris pleaded. "You have to listen to me. What happened tonight, it wasn't a practical joke. Her father turned away from her, a scowl on his face. "Chris, I'm sorry. We'll talk tomorrow. Your mother and I. We're both too angry and too upset to talk now." "But, Dad..." Ignoring her, he stormed out of the room. She listened to his footsteps, hard and hurried, down the stairs. Then Chris slowly turned to Lindy. "Now do you believe me?" I don't know what to believe," Lindy replied. "It was just so unbelievably gross." "Lindy, Dad's right. Let's talk tomorrow," Lindy said. "I'm sure everything will be clearer and calmer tomorrow." But Chris couldn't sleep. She shifted from side to side, uncomfortable, wide awake. She pulled the pillow over her face, held it there for a while, welcoming the soft darkness then tossed it to the floor. I'm never going to sleep again, she thought. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the hideous scene in the auditorium once again. She heard the astonished cries of the audience, the kids and their parents, and she heard the cries of shock turn to groans of disgust as the putrid gunk poured out over everyone. Sickening, so totally sickening. And everyone blamed her. My life is ruined, Chris thought. I can never go back there again. I can never go to school. I can never show my face anywhere. Ruined, my whole life, ruined by that stupid dummy. In the next bed, Lindy snored softly in a slow, steady rhythm. Chris turned her eyes to the bedroom window. The curtains hung down over the window, filtering the pale moonlight from outside. Slappy sat in his usual place in the chair in front of the window, bent in two, his head between his knees. Stupid dummies, Chris thought bitterly. So stupid! And now my life is ruined. She glanced at the clock. 1:20. Outside the window, she heard a low, rumbling sound, a soft whistle of brakes, probably a large truck going by. Chris yawned. She closed her eyes and saw the gross green gunk spewing out of Mr. Wood's mouth. Will I see that every time I close my eyes? She wondered. What on earth was it? How could everyone blame me for something so... The rumbling of the truck faded into the distance. But then Chris heard another sound, a rustling sound, a soft footstep. Someone was moving. She sucked in her breath and held it, listening hard. Silence now. Silence so heavy she could hear the loud thudding of her heart. Then another soft footstep. A shadow moved. The closet door swung open. Or was it just shadows shifting? No, someone was moving. Moving from the open closet. Someone was creeping toward the bedroom door. Creeping so softly, so silently. Her heart pounding, Chris pulled herself up, trying not to make a sound. Realizing that she'd been holding her breath, she let it out slowly, silently. She took another breath, then sat up. The shadow moved slowly to the door. Chris lowered her feet to the floor, staring hard into the darkness, her eyes staying with the silent, moving figure. What's happening? She wondered. The shadow moved again. She heard a scraping sound, the sound of a sleeve brushing the door frame. Chris pushed herself to her feet. Her legs felt shaky as she crept to the door, following the moving shadow. Out in the hallway, even darker out here because there were no windows. Toward the stairway, the shadow moved more quickly now. Chris followed, her bare feet moving lightly over the thin carpet. What's happening? She thought. She caught up to the shadowy figure on the landing. Hey, she called, her voice a tight whisper. She grabbed the shoulder and turned the figure around and stared into the grinning face of Mr. Wood. Mr. Wood blinked, then hissed at her in an ugly sound, a menacing sound. In the darkness of the stairwell, his painted grin became a threatening leer. In her fright, Chris squeezed the dummy's shoulder, wrapping her fingers around the harsh fabric of his shirt. This is impossible, she whispered. He blinked again. He giggled. His mouth opened, making his grin grow wider. He tried to tug out of Chris's grasp, but she hung on without even realizing she was holding him. "But you're a dummy," she squealed. He giggled again. "So are you," he replied. His voice was a deep growl like the angry snarl of a large dog. "You can't walk," Chris cried, her voice trembling. The dummy giggled its ugly giggle again. "You can't be alive," Chris exclaimed. "Let go of me! Now!" The dummy growled. Chris held on, tightening her grip. "I'm dreaming," Chris told herself aloud. "I have to be dreaming." "I'm not a dream. I'm a nightmare!" the dummy exclaimed and tossed back his wooden head, laughing. Still gripping the shoulder of the shirt, Chris stared through the darkness at the grinning face. The air seemed to grow heavy and hot. She felt as if she couldn't breathe, as if she were suffocating. What was that sound? It took her a while to recognize the strained gasps of her own breathing. "Let go of me," the dummy repeated, "or I'll throw you down the stairs." He tried once again to tug out of her grasp. "No," Chris insisted, holding tight. I'm putting you back in the closet." The dummy laughed, then pushed his painted face close to Chris's face. "You can't keep me there." "I'm locking you in. I'm locking you in a box. In something," Chris declared, panic clouding her thoughts. The darkness seemed to descend over her, choking her, weighing her down. "Let go of me!" The dummy pulled hard. Chris reached out her other hand and grabbed him around the waist. "Let go of me!" he snarled in his raspy, deep rumble of a voice. "I'm in charge now. You will listen to me. This is my house now." He pulled hard. Chris encircled his waist. They both fell onto the stairs, rolling down a few steps. "Let go!" the dummy ordered. He rolled on top of her, his wild eyes glaring into hers. She pushed him off, tried to pin his arms behind his back. He was surprisingly strong. He pulled back one arm, then shoved a fist hard into the pit of her stomach. "Oh!" Chris groaned, feeling the breath knocked out of her. The dummy took advantage of her momentary weakness and pulled free. Grasping the banister with one hand, he tried to pull himself past her and down the stairs, but Chris shot out a foot and tripped him. Still struggling to breathe, she pounced onto his back. Then she pulled him away from the banister and pushed him down hard onto a step. "Oh!" Chris gasped loudly as the overhead hall light flashed on. She closed her eyes against the sudden harsh intrusion. The dummy struggled to pull out from under her, but she pushed down on his back with all her weight. "Chris, what on earth?" Lindy's startled voice called down from the top step. "It's Mr. Wood!" Chris managed to cry up to her. "He's alive!" She pushed down hard, sprawled over the dummy, keeping him pinned beneath her. "Chris, what are you doing?" Lindy demanded. "Are you okay?" "No!" Chris exclaimed. "I'm not okay. Please, Lindy, go get Mom and Dad. Mr. Wood, he's alive!" "It's just a dummy," Lindy called down, taking a few reluctant steps toward her sister. "Get up, Chris. Have you lost your mind?" "Listen to me," Chris shrieked at the top of her lungs. "Get Mom and Dad before he escapes." But Lindy didn't move. She stared down at her sister, her long hair falling in tangles about her face, her features twisted in horror. "Get up, Chris. Please, get up. Let's go back to bed." "I'm telling you, he's alive!" Chris cried desperately. "You've got to believe me, Lindy. You've got to!" The dummy lay lifelessly beneath her, his face buried in the carpet, his arms and legs sprawled out to the sides. "You had a nightmare," Lindy insisted, climbing down step by step, holding her long nightshirt up above her ankles until she was standing right above Chris. "Come back to bed, Chris. It was just a nightmare. The horrible thing that happened at the concert, it gave you a nightmare, that's all." Gasping for breath, Chris lifted herself up and twisted her head to face her sister. Grabbing the banister with one hand, she raised herself a little. The instant she lightened up on him, the dummy grabbed the edge of the stair with both hands and pulled himself out from under her. Half falling, half crawling, he scrambled down the rest of the stairs. "No! No, I don't believe it!" Lindy shrieked, seeing the dummy move. "Go get Mom and Dad!" Chris said. "Hurry!" Her mouth wide open in shocked disbelief, Lindy turned and headed back up the stairs, screaming for her parents. Chris dived off the step. Thrusting her arms in front of her, she tackled Mr. Wood from behind, wrapping her arms around his waist. His head hit the carpet hard as they both crumpled to the floor. He uttered a low, throaty cry of pain. His eyes closed. He didn't move. Dazed, her chest heaving, her entire body trembling, Chris slowly climbed to her feet. She quickly pressed a foot on the dummy's back to hold him in place. "Mom! Dad! Where are you?" she cried aloud. "Hurry!" The dummy raised its head. He let out an angry growl and started to thrash his arms and legs wildly. Chris pressed her foot hard against his back. "Let go!" he growled viciously. Chris heard voices upstairs. "Mom! Dad! Down here!" she called up to them. Both of her parents appeared at the upstairs landing, their faces filled with worry. "Look!" Chris cried, frantically pointing down to the dummy beneath her foot. "Look at what?" Mr. Powell cried, adjusting his pajama top. Chris pointed down to the dummy under her foot. He's trying to get away," she stammered. But Mr. Wood lay lifeless on his stomach. "Is this supposed to be a joke?" Mrs. Powell demanded angrily, hands at the waist of her cotton nightgown. "I don't get it," Mr. Powell said, shaking his head. "Mr. Wood, he ran down the stairs," Chris said frantically. "He's been doing everything. This is not funny," Mrs. Powell said wearily, running a hand through her blonde hair. "It isn't funny at all, Chris. Waking everyone up in the middle of the night? I really think you've lost your mind. I'm very worried about you," Mr. Powell added. "I mean, after what happened at school tonight?" "Listen to me," Chris shrieked. She bent down and pulled Mr. Wood up from the floor. Holding him by the shoulders, she shook him hard. "He moves, he runs, he talks. He's alive." She stopped shaking the dummy and let go. He slumped lifelessly to the floor, falling in an unmoving heap at her feet. "I think maybe you need to see a doctor," Mr. Powell said, his face tightening with concern. No, I saw him too, Lindy said, coming to Chris's aid. Chris is right. The dummy did move. But then she added, I think it moved. You're a big help, Lindy, Chris thought, suddenly feeling weak and drained. Is this another stupid prank? Mrs. Powell asked angrily. After what happened at school tonight, I'd think that would be enough. But Mom, Chris started, staring down at the lifeless heap at her feet. Back to bed, Mrs. Powell ordered. There's no school tomorrow. We'll have plenty of time to discuss punishments for you two. Me? Lindy cried, outraged. What did I do? Mom, we're telling the truth, Chris insisted. I still don't get the joke, Mr. Powell said, shaking his head. He turned to his wife. Were we supposed to believe her or something? Get to bed, both of you. Now, their mother snapped. She and their father disappeared from the upstairs landing, heading angrily back down the hall to their room. Lindy remained, one hand on the top of the banister, staring down regretfully at Chris. You believe me, don't you? Chris called up to her. Yeah, I guess, Lindy replied doubtfully, lowering her eyes to the dummy at Chris's feet. Chris looked down too. She saw Mr. Wood blink. He started to straighten up. Whoa! She uttered an alarmed cry and grabbed him by the neck. Lindy, hurry! She called. He's moving again! What should we do? Lindy stammered, making her way hesitantly down the stairs. I don't know, Chris replied as the dummy thrashed his arms and legs against the carpet, trying desperately to free himself from her two-handed grip on his neck. We've got to... There's nothing you can do, Mr. Wood snarled. You will be my slaves now. I'm alive once again. Alive! But how? Chris demanded, staring at him in disbelief. You're a dummy. How? The dummy snickered. You brought me back to life, he told her in his raspy voice. You read the ancient words. The ancient words? What was he talking about? And then Chris remembered. She had read the strange-sounding words from the sheet of paper in the dummy's shirt pocket. I am back, thanks to you, the dummy growled. And now you and your sister will serve me. As she stared in horror at the grinning dummy, an idea popped into Chris's mind. The paper, she had tucked it back into his pocket. If I read the words again, Chris thought, it will put him back to sleep. She reached out and grabbed him. He tried to jerk away, but she was too quick. The folded sheet of yellow paper was in her hand. Give me that! He cried. He swiped at it, but Chris swung it out of his reach. She unfolded it quickly, and before the dummy could grab the paper out of her hands, she read the strange words aloud. Karu, Mari, Odana Loma, Malonu, Karano. Both sisters stared at the dummy, waiting for him to collapse. But he gripped the banister and tossed his head back in an amused, scornful laugh. Those are the words of the ancient sorcerer to bring me to life, he proclaimed. Those aren't the words to kill me. Kill him? Yes, Chris thought frantically. She tossed down the yellow paper disgustedly. We have no choice. We have to kill him, Lindy. Huh? Her sister's face filled with surprise. Chris grabbed the dummy by the shoulders and held on tightly. "I'll hold him. You pull his head off." Lindy was beside her now. She had to duck away from Mr. Wood's thrashing feet. "I'll hold him still," Chris repeated. "Grab his head. Pull it off." You're sure?" Lindy hesitated, her features tight with fear. "Just do it!" Chris screamed. She let her hand slide down Mr. Wood's waist. Lindy grabbed his head in both hands. "Let go of me!" the dummy rasped. "Pull!" Chris cried to her terrified sister. Holding the dummy tightly around the waist, she leaned back, pulling him away from her sister. Lindy's hands were wrapped tightly around the dummy's head. With a loud groan, she pulled hard. The head didn't come off. Mr. Wood uttered a high-pitched giggle. "Stop! You're tickling me!" he rasped. "Pull harder!" Chris ordered her sister. Lindy's face was bright red. She tightened her grip on the dummy and pulled again, tugging with all her strength. The dummy giggled his shrill, unpleasant giggle. It won't come off," Lindy said, sighing in defeat. "Twist it off," Chris suggested frantically. The dummy thrashed out with his feet, kicking Chris in the stomach, but she held on. "Twist the head off," she cried. Lindy tried to turn the head. The dummy giggled. "It won't twist," Lindy cried in frustration. She let go of the head and took a step back. Mr. Wood raised his head, stared up at Lindy, and grinned. "You can't kill me. I have powers." "What do we do?" Lindy cried, raising her eyes to Chris. "This is my house now," the dummy rasped, grinning at Lindy as it struggled to wriggle out of Chris's arms. "You will do as I say now. Put me down." "What do we do?" Lindy repeated. "Take him upstairs. We'll cut his head off," Chris replied. Mr. Wood swung his head around, his eyes stretched open in an evil glare. "Ow!" Chris cried out in surprise as the dummy snapped his jaws over her arm, biting her. She pulled her arm away and, without thinking, slapped the dummy's wooden head with the palm of her hand. The dummy giggled in response. "Violence, violence!" he said in a mock scolding tone. "Get those sharp scissors in your drawer," Lindy instructed her sister. "I'll carry him up to our room." Her arm throbbed where he had bitten her, but she held on to him tightly and carried him up to their bedroom. Lindy had already pulled the long metal scissors from the drawer. Her hand trembled as she opened and closed the blades. "Below the neck," Chris said, holding Mr. Wood tightly by the shoulders. He hissed furiously at her. She dodged as he tried to kick her with both sneakered feet. Holding the scissors with two hands, Lindy tried cutting the head off at the neck. The scissors didn't cut, so she tried a sawing motion. Mr. Wood giggled. "I told you, you can't kill me." "It isn't going to work," Lindy cried, tears of frustration running down her cheeks. "Now what?" "We'll put him in the closet, then we can think," Chris replied. "You have no need to think. You are my slaves," the dummy rasped. "You will do whatever I ask. I will be in charge from now on." "No way," Chris muttered, shaking her head. "What if we won't help you?" Lindy demanded. The dummy turned to her. casting her a hard, angry stare.
"Then I'll start hurting the ones you love," he said casually. "Your parents, your friends, or maybe that disgusting dog that's always yapping at me."
He tossed back his head, and a dry, evil laugh escaped his wooden lips. "Lock him in the closet," Lindy suggested, "till we figure out how to get rid of him." Grandma needs a drink of water. Her throat is getting dry.
"You can't get rid of me,"
Mr. Wood insisted.
"Don't make me angry. I have powers. I'm warning you. I'm starting to get tired of your stupid attempts to harm me."
"The closet doesn't lock, remember?" Chris cried, struggling to hold on to the wriggling dummy. "Oh, wait, how about this?" Lindy hurried to the closet. She pulled out an old suitcase from the back. "Perfect," Chris said.
"I'm warning you,"
Mr. Wood threatened.
"You're becoming very tiresome."
With a hard tug, he pulled himself free of Chris. She dove to tackle him, but he darted out from under her. She fell face down onto her bed. The dummy ran to the center of the room, then turned his eyes to the doorway, as if trying to decide where to go.
"You must do as I tell you,"
he said darkly, raising a wooden hand toward Lindy.
"I will not run from you two. You are to be my slaves."
"No!" Chris cried, pushing herself up. She and her sister both dove at the dummy. Lindy grabbed his arms. Chris ducked to grab his ankles. Working together, they stuffed him into the open suitcase.
"You will regret this,"
he threatened, kicking his legs, struggling to hit them.
"You will pay dearly for this. Now, someone will die."
He continued screaming after Chris latched the suitcase and shoved it into the closet. She quickly closed the closet door, then leaned her back against it, sighing wearily. "Now what?" she asked Lindy. I think we'll stop there and finish up next time. Love you guys.